Driven by the distrust fueled by his wife, a millionaire set up a cruel test. He left a suitcase with a fortune on a street. But it was found by an orphan girl who used all the money to help shelters, animals and children. If this beautiful story of overcoming and love interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you are watching us from. The sun was timidly peeking between Chicago's buildings when Richard Thompson parked his black Mercedes with tinted windows on Flower Street in the Hope Village neighborhood. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the steering wheel, observing the morning bustle in that modest area of the city. Children rushed to school, workers headed to bus stops, and some homeless people still dozed under the awnings of small businesses. Richard was a 52-year-old man, owner of one of the country's largest construction companies. His fortune was estimated in the hundreds of millions of dollars, built over decades of hard work and smart decisions in the real estate market. But all that wealth had failed to fill the emptiness he'd felt in his chest since losing his parents in an accident when he was only 25. It was during this vulnerable phase of his life that he met Patricia Blackwell, a stunning woman from a traditional Chicago family. She had a sophisticated air that impressed him, always wearing designer clothes and frequenting the best restaurants in the city. Patricia knew exactly what to say to win over a man fragile with grief, and Richard, hungry for companionship and affection, fell hopelessly in love. During the 15 years of marriage that followed, Patricia molded Richard according to her own convictions. She had an extremely elitist and prejudiced worldview. To her, people from lower social classes were naturally dishonest, opportunistic, and dangerous. Over time, these ideas took root in Richard's mind, and he began to distrust everyone around him, especially those who weren't part of his social circle. "Richard, you need to stop being so naive," Patricia would say whenever he showed any gesture of generosity. "These people only approach you out of self-interest. If they had the slightest opportunity, they would steal everything you have," without blinking an eye. The night before, during dinner in the couple's luxurious apartment in the lakeside neighborhood, Patricia had repeated her poisonous discourse once again. They were discussing a news report that had aired on television, showing children in vulnerable situations on the city streets. "Look at these children," Patricia commented with disdain, adjusting the pearl necklace around her neck. "Their parents send them to the streets to beg for money and evoke pity from people. It's all an act. If you gave $1,000 to one of these children, I'm certain they wouldn't use it to buy food. They'd waste it on nonsense or hand it over to the adults who exploit them." Richard observed the images on the 55-inch television, feeling a mixture of indignation and curiosity. Was Patricia right? Did her worldview, built during their years together, really correspond to reality? It was then that a disturbing idea emerged in his mind. What if he could prove once and for all whether his wife's theory was correct? What if he could conduct a test that would reveal the true nature of these people Patricia so despised? "You know what, Patricia," said Richard, turning off the television and rising from his Italian leather armchair. "I think you're right. These people are all the same, dishonest by nature." Patricia smiled with satisfaction, thinking she had once again convinced her husband of her ideas. "Exactly, darling. It's important that you understand this. Our social class protects us from these negative influences." That night, Richard couldn't sleep. He got up several times, walking through the corridors of the apartment, mentally developing a plan he considered brilliant. He would go to a humble neighborhood, leave a briefcase full of money in a strategic location, and observe what would happen. He was certain that the first person who found the briefcase would try to keep the money, definitively proving that Patricia was right. In the morning, Richard went to the safe in his private office and withdrew $300,000 in $150 bills. He stored all the money in a brown leather briefcase he had received as a gift years earlier. The weight of the money made the briefcase considerably heavy, but that was exactly what he wanted, for it to seem valuable enough to arouse the covetousness of any person. He chose Hope Village because he had done some research online and discovered it was an area with many vulnerable children. According to the statistics he found, it was common to see unaccompanied minors on the streets, some abandoned, others simply neglected by families who could barely support themselves. Now parked on that street, Richard felt his heart beating rapidly. He got out of the car, looked around to make sure no one was watching him, and strategically placed the briefcase near a bus stop, but a little distance away, as if it had been forgotten by someone who had missed the bus. The briefcase was clearly visible to anyone passing by, but not so obvious as to appear like an obvious trap. Richard returned to his car and positioned himself so that he could observe everything through the rearview mirror and side windows without being noticed. The first passers-by who passed the briefcase didn't even notice it. They were in a hurry, focused on their own problems. A middle-aged man ran by looking at the watch on his wrist, clearly late for some appointment. A woman with 2 small children passed by pushing a baby carriage, focused on controlling the children. Richard began to wonder if his plan would work. Maybe people wouldn't notice the briefcase, or maybe they were just too honest to touch something that wasn't theirs. For a moment, he even felt relieved at this possibility, but quickly dismissed the thought. Patricia had to be right. His entire worldview depended on it. It was then that she appeared. A small, thin girl walking alone on the sidewalk. She appeared to be about 7 years old, wearing a faded pink dress and worn sandals that seemed too big for her feet. Her brown hair was tied in 2 simple braids, and she carried a small plastic bag in her hands. Richard watched attentively as the girl approached the bus stop. She wasn't running or playing like most children her age. She walked with firm steps, but there was something in her gaze that demonstrated a premature maturity, as if she had already experienced things that had forced her to grow up before her time. When the girl spotted the briefcase, she stopped immediately. She looked around as if searching for the owner. Richard felt his pulse quicken. This was exactly what he had been waiting for. Now she would grab the briefcase and try to run away with it, proving that Patricia was right about the nature of poor people. But the girl didn't rush. She approached the briefcase carefully, crouched down beside it, and observed it for a few moments. Richard could see that she was hesitant, as if she were making an important decision. Her small hands gently touched the leather of the briefcase, feeling its texture and weight. Slowly, the girl opened the briefcase's latch. Richard held his breath, preparing to see her reaction upon discovering all that money. When the briefcase opened completely, revealing the carefully organized stacks of bills, the girl remained completely still. Richard expected to see greed in her eyes, a rush to grab the money and run away. But what he saw was something completely different. The girl's eyes widened, not with covetousness, but with surprise and even concern. She quickly closed the briefcase and looked around again, as if searching for someone who might have lost something so valuable. For several minutes, the girl remained there, sitting on the sidewalk next to the briefcase, as if waiting for the owner to appear. Richard began to feel impatient. Why wasn't she doing what he expected? Why wasn't she taking the money and running away? Finally, the girl stood up, picked up the briefcase with some difficulty due to its weight, and began to walk. Richard felt a mixture of disappointment and curiosity. Where was she going? What did she intend to do with the briefcase? Discreetly, Richard started the car and began to follow the girl at a safe distance. She walked slowly due to the weight of the briefcase, stopping now and then to rest. Richard noticed that she didn't try to hide the briefcase or act as if she were doing something wrong. On the contrary, she seemed to be carrying a burden that wasn't hers but for which she felt responsible. The girl walked along Flower Street toward the center of Hope Village, carrying the heavy briefcase with determination. Richard followed her from a distance, maintaining a safe distance to avoid being noticed. With each block, his curiosity grew. Where was this child taking a briefcase with $300,000? After about 20 minutes of walking, the girl stopped in front of a small one-story house painted light blue. The structure was simple, with just a weathered wooden door and 2 windows protected by old bars. A small garden in front of the house was well maintained, with some colorful flowers that contrasted with the simplicity of the place. Richard parked his car a few yards away and watched as the girl entered the house. She left the briefcase outside leaning against the wall and disappeared for a few minutes. When she returned, she brought with her a woman of approximately 40, thin, with black hair tied in a simple ponytail. The woman looked at the briefcase, with surprise, and then at the girl. Richard couldn't hear what they were talking about, but from their body language, it seemed that the girl was explaining where she had found the briefcase. The woman appeared concerned, gesturing and looking around as if searching for someone. "Emily, honey, where did you get this?" asked Tanya Davis, the girl's aunt, with a worried expression on her face. Tanya worked as a house cleaner in 3 different homes and could barely pay the basic bills, but she had always strived to raise Emily in the best way possible after her younger sister had died in an accident when the girl was only 3 years old. "I found it on the street, Aunt Tanya," Emily answered honestly. "It was near the bus stop. I think someone forgot it. There's a lot of money inside." Tanya opened the briefcase and almost fainted when she saw the amount of money. She had never seen so much money together in her entire life. For a moment, she thought about how that sum could solve all her financial problems. She could pay off all her debts, buy new clothes for Emily, maybe even rent a better house in a safer neighborhood. But Tanya was a woman of solid principles. She had raised Emily, always teaching the importance of honesty and integrity. She couldn't, now faced with a situation like this, do the opposite of what she had always preached. "Emily, this doesn't belong to us," said Tanya, closing the briefcase. "We need to find the owner. Someone must be desperately looking for this." Emily nodded her head. She had already thought the same thing. Even knowing that money could completely change their lives, she knew it wouldn't be right to keep something that belonged to someone else. "But how will we find the owner, Aunt Tanya?" asked Emily, sitting on the small plastic chair on the house's porch. Tanya thought for a few moments before answering. "We could take the briefcase to the police station, but I've heard stories of people who never saw their belongings again after handing them over to the police. We could also place an ad in the local newspaper, but we don't have money to pay for that. Let's keep the briefcase here at home for a few days," Tanya decided. "If no one comes looking for it, then we'll take it to the police station." Richard observed the whole scene from a distance, feeling increasingly confused. This wasn't happening as he had planned. The girl hadn't tried to run away with the money. On the contrary, she had taken the briefcase home and was talking with what appeared to be a responsible adult about what to do. During the next 3 days, Richard discreetly returned to the neighborhood to observe the house. His obsession with discovering what would happen to the briefcase was consuming his thoughts. Patricia had noticed his distraction, but he invented excuses about problems at the company. On the 3rd day, something unexpected happened. Richard saw Emily leave the house, carrying the briefcase again. This time she was accompanied by Tanya. The two walked to the bus stop and took a bus heading downtown. Richard followed them by car, always keeping a safe distance. The bus stopped in front of the county courthouse, and Richard thought they would finally turn the briefcase over to the authorities. But to his surprise, Emily and Tanya walked in the opposite direction, entering a busy commercial street. Their first stop was at a building supply store. Richard observed from a distance as Emily and Tanya talked with the owner. After a few minutes, they left the store carrying several bags of dog and cat food. Next, they went to a small veterinary clinic. Richard was intrigued to see Emily enter the clinic alone while Tanya waited outside. The girl spent about 15 minutes inside, talking with someone Richard couldn't see. When she left the clinic, Emily was smiling. She and Tanya carried the bags of pet food to a vacant lot behind the clinic, where Richard could see several abandoned dogs and cats living there. Emily began to distribute the food among the animals, which ran in her direction as soon as they saw her coming. Richard was completely perplexed. What was happening? Why was the girl spending money that wasn't hers on abandoned animals? This made no sense in the logic that Patricia had built in his mind, but the surprises didn't stop there. After caring for the animals, Emily and Tanya walked to an orphanage for children maintained by a religious institution. Richard saw Emily enter the place, carrying a large envelope. She spent about half an hour inside, talking with the nuns who ran the orphanage. "Sister Helen," Emily said to the nun who received her, "a friend of mine asked me to bring this here. She said it's to help the children who live here." Sister Helen opened the envelope and was surprised to find a considerable amount of money. "But who is this friend, my child? We need to know so we can thank her properly." "She doesn't want anyone to know who she is," Emily replied. "She said that the important thing is to help the children. You can use the money to buy food, clothes, Toys, whatever you need. Sister Helen was moved. The orphanage had been experiencing financial difficulties for weeks, and that donation came as a blessing from heaven. Your friend is an angel, Emily. Tell her that our children are very grateful. Richard watched all of this from his car, feeling a strange emotion grow in his chest. This girl was using the money from the briefcase to help other needy people. She hadn't kept anything for herself, hadn't bought new clothes, sweets, or toys. She was distributing everything to those who needed it more than she did. For the rest of the afternoon, Richard continued following Emily and Tanya. They visited 2 more places, a support house for homeless people, where they left another envelope with money, and a pharmacy, where Emily paid for several medications that were delivered directly to elderly people waiting outside. When they finally returned home at the end of the day, Emily was carrying the empty briefcase. All the money had been distributed to people and causes that needed help. The girl hadn't kept even a penny for herself. That night, Richard couldn't sleep. He lay in bed next to Patricia, who was snoring softly, thinking about everything he had witnessed during that day. His worldview was being completely shaken. All the theory that his wife had built about poor people being dishonest had been destroyed by the action of a 7-year-old girl. Emily had not only been honest upon finding the briefcase, but she had also used all that money to help other needy people. She had every reason to justify keeping the money. She was an orphan, poor, living in precarious conditions. But even so, she chose to do good for other people who were in even more difficult situations than her own. Richard got up from the bed and went to the apartment window, observing the city lights below. For 15 years, he had believed in Patricia's discourse about human nature. He had become suspicious, prejudiced, thinking that poor people were naturally dishonest. But a 7-year-old child had proven that he was completely wrong. Tears began to run down Richard's face. They were tears of shame, of regret, but also of hope. If someone like Emily existed in the world, then perhaps there was hope for humanity. Perhaps there was hope for himself. For the first time in years, Richard deeply questioned his convictions, and especially the influence that Patricia had over him. Was he living a life based on lies and prejudices? Had he become a person he no longer recognized? The next morning, Richard woke up with a determination he hadn't felt in years. During breakfast, he observed Patricia flipping through a luxury magazine, making derogatory comments about people who appeared in the social news. Her voice, which had previously seemed sophisticated and intellectual to him, now sounded empty and prejudiced. "Richard, are you listening to me?" asked Patricia, noticing her husband's distraction. "I was commenting on that report from yesterday. Did you see what these people from the peripheral neighborhoods are like? Always involved in trouble, always causing problems for society." Richard looked at his wife, and for the first time in years, truly saw her. Her eyes were cold, her expression one of constant disdain. How had he fallen in love with someone like this? How had he allowed this woman to shape his way of seeing the world? "Patricia, sometimes I think you're very harsh in your judgments," said Richard, cautiously testing his wife's reaction. Patricia laughed with contempt. "Harsh? Richard, I'm realistic. You've always been too naive. Luckily, I'm here to open your eyes to the reality of things." Richard didn't respond, but inside he felt a revolt growing. Patricia wasn't opening his eyes to reality. On the contrary, she was blindfolding his eyes to the true human nature, the goodness that existed in people like Emily. During the days that followed, Richard couldn't stop thinking about the girl. He returned a few times to the Hope Village neighborhood, but more discreetly, just to observe from a distance. He would see Emily leaving for school in the morning, always wearing the same faded pink dress, but with a smile on her face that lit up the entire street. Richard decided that he needed to know more about Emily's life. He discreetly hired a private investigator, Carl Fisher, an experienced man who had worked for years in the civil police before opening his own office. "Mr. Thompson," said Carl during their first meeting in Richard's office, "are you sure you want me to investigate a 7-year-old child? This seems a bit strange to me." Richard hesitated. He couldn't tell Carl the real reason, as that would involve admitting the cruel test he had conducted. "It's a personal matter, Carl. Let's say I have reasons to believe this child might have an interesting story. I need to know more about her life, her family, her circumstances. Carl accepted the job, but reluctantly. He spent a week investigating the lives of Emily and Tanya, talking with neighbors, school teachers, local merchants. What he discovered was touching and at the same time tragic. "Mr. Thompson," reported Carl during their second meeting, "this girl has a very sad but at the same time admirable story. Her parents died in a car accident when she was 3 years old. Since then, she has lived with her aunt, Tanya Davis, who works as a house cleaner to support them. Both..." Richard listened attentively as Carl continued his report. "Tanya is a hard-working and honest woman, very respected in the neighborhood, but she's going through serious financial difficulties. She's 3 months behind on rent and has accumulated electricity and water bills. Even so, she refuses to accept help from neighbors, saying she doesn't want to be a burden to anyone." "And the girl, Emily?" asked Richard, eager to know more. "This girl is special," said Carl with a genuine smile. "Everyone in the neighborhood adores her. She helps elderly neighbors, feeds abandoned animals on the street, always has a kind word for everyone. The teachers at the school say she's one of the most dedicated students they've ever seen, despite all the difficulties." Carl opened his folder and showed some photos he had taken discreetly. "Look at this, Mr. Thompson. This is Emily, helping Mrs. Wilson, an 80-year-old lady who lives alone. Emily goes there every day after school to see if she needs anything." Richard observed the photo and felt his heart tighten. Emily was helping the elderly lady carry shopping bags with that same sincere smile he had seen on the day she found the briefcase. "And this one," continued Carl, showing another photo, "is her sharing her school lunch with a boy who'd forgotten his at home. The teacher told me this happens at least 3 times a week. Emily always shares her food with other classmates who don't have anything to eat." Tears began to well up in Richard's eyes. Emily hadn't acted altruistically just with the money from the briefcase. That was her way of being, her essence. Even having so little, she always found a way to help those who had even less. "There's one more interesting thing, Mr. Thompson," said Carl, putting away the photos. "In the last few days, some people in the neighborhood have commented about mysterious donations that have been appearing. The veterinary clinic received money to treat abandoned animals. The orphanage received a considerable amount, and several elderly people received help to buy medications." Richard feigned surprise, but inside he knew exactly where these donations were coming from. "No one knows who's making these donations," continued Carl. "They always appear as being from a friend or a person who prefers not to be identified. It's very strange, but everyone is happy with the help." "And you don't have any clue about who it might be?" asked Richard, curious to know if Carl had made any connection. "Well, there are some theories. Some neighbors think it might be someone from outside the neighborhood who decided to help. Others think it might be some local merchant who got rich and now wants to give back to the community, but there's no concrete evidence." Carl closed his folder and prepared to leave. "Mr. Thompson, if I may ask, why the special interest in this family? They are humble people, but very dignified. They're not involved in anything questionable." Richard invented an excuse about considering making donations to needy families and wanting to make sure they were honest people. Carl seemed to accept the explanation and said goodbye. Alone in his office, Richard reflected on everything he had discovered. Emily wasn't just an honest girl who had returned a briefcase full of money. She was an extraordinary person who, even living in difficult conditions, always found ways to help other needy people. Guilt began to consume Richard. He had used an innocent child in a cruel experiment based on the poisonous prejudices that Patricia had implanted in his mind. Emily had been tested in a way she didn't even know about, and she had passed the test with flying colors, showing a nobility of character that he himself wasn't sure he possessed. That night, Richard made a decision that would change the course of his life. He could no longer continue living based on lies and prejudices. He could no longer allow Patricia to control his way of seeing the world. And most importantly, he couldn't let Emily continue living in hardship when he had the power to change her reality. But before taking any action, Richard knew he needed to meet Emily personally. He needed to look into the eyes of that extraordinary girl and ask forgiveness for what he had done, even if she didn't know she had been tested. Richard decided that the next day he would go to Hope Village, no longer as a hidden observer, but as a repentant man seeking redemption. He didn't yet know how he would approach Emily and Tanya, but he knew he needed to do it in the most honest way possible. While Patricia slept beside him, murmuring something about social dinners and high society events, Richard remained awake, planning how he could redeem himself for the mistake he had made. For the first time in years, he felt he was on the right path, guided not by his wife's prejudices, but by the lesson in humanity that a 7-year-old girl had taught him. Richard's transformation had begun the moment he saw Emily close the briefcase and look for the owner. Now, days later, this transformation was deepening, leading him to question not only his prejudices, but the entire foundation of his marriage and social life. Richard knew that difficult changes were coming, but for the first time in a long time, he felt hope for the future. The next day, Richard woke up determined to put his plan into action. He wore simple clothes, a white polo shirt and jeans, very different from the Italian suits he usually wore. He wanted to appear as ordinary as possible to approach Emily and Tanya without arousing suspicion. He drove to Hope Village in the middle of the morning, when he knew Emily would be at school and Tanya would probably be working in one of the houses where she cleaned. He parked his car a few blocks away from the Blue House and walked there, observing the neighborhood's activity with different eyes. For the first time, Richard really paid attention to the details of the community. He saw children playing in the street, even without having expensive toys. He observed neighbors talking at their doorsteps, demonstrating a closeness and solidarity that he had never experienced in his luxury condominium. There was a vibrant life there, full of simplicity and authenticity. Richard knew he needed to be patient and find the right way to approach them. He couldn't simply knock on the door and introduce himself as a rich businessman who wanted to help. That would seem suspicious and could frighten Tanya and Emily. He decided to start by frequenting the places Emily usually visited. He remembered the vacant lot where she had taken pet food for the abandoned animals. He went there and found dozens of dogs and cats living in the place, some clearly sick and malnourished. Richard felt his heart tighten at the condition of those animals. He had never been sensitized to causes like this before. Patricia always said it was foolish to spend money on street animals when there were so many human problems to solve. But seeing those sad and hopeful looks from the animals, Richard understood why Emily had chosen to help them. He returned home and, without telling Patricia anything, called a luxury pet shop and ordered several bags of quality pet food, veterinary, medications and blankets. He asked for everything to be delivered directly to the vacant lot with a simple note from a friend of the animals. During the following week, Richard established a routine. Every morning after Patricia left for her social activities, he would go to Hope Village. Not to observe in hiding as before, but to get to know the community. He began frequenting a small bakery near Emily's house, where he would sit to have coffee and observe the local movement. Mr. Anthony, the bakery owner, was a 60-year-old man, friendly and talkative. In a few days, Richard had already become a regular customer, always having his morning coffee there. "You're not from around here, are you?" asked Mr. Anthony on a Thursday morning, serving coffee to Richard. "No, I live in another neighborhood," replied Richard, carefully choosing his words. "But I really like it here. The people are welcoming." "Ah, yes. Here we're like one big family," said Mr. Anthony with pride. "Everyone knows each other. Everyone helps each other. It's not like those rich neighborhoods where nobody talks to each other." Richard smiled ironically, thinking about his own condominium, where he indeed didn't even know the neighbors in the apartment next door. "There's a girl here in the neighborhood, Emily, who's a little angel," continued Mr. Anthony. "Tanya's daughter, who works hard to raise the girl alone. Emily always comes here to ask for yesterday's leftover bread to give to the homeless. A child with a heart of gold." Richard felt a strong emotion upon hearing Mr. Anthony talk about Emily. He wanted to tell him about what he had witnessed, about the extraordinary generosity of the girl, but he knew he couldn't. "She seems to be a special girl indeed," commented Richard. "Special is an understatement," said Mr. Anthony, cleaning the counter with a cloth. "Last week a well-dressed gentleman showed up here asking about her, said it was for a school project, or something like that. I was a bit suspicious, you know. There are a lot of crazy people out there." Richard was intrigued. Another man had asked about Emily. Who could it be? "Do you remember what this man looked like?" asked Richard, trying to sound casual. Man, I'm not good at remembering faces, said Mr. Anthony, scratching his head. But he was a tall guy, well-dressed, drove an expensive car. Didn't seem like a good thing. Richard was concerned. Could it be that someone else was investigating Emily? Why? He decided to be more attentive in the coming days. It was on Friday of that same week that Richard finally had the opportunity he was waiting for. He was leaving the bakery when he saw Emily walking towards school, but she seemed to be late. The girl was running, carrying a worn school backpack and constantly looking at a cheap wristwatch she wore. Suddenly, Emily tripped on a loose stone on the sidewalk and fell, scattering her notebooks and pencils on the ground. Richard immediately ran to help her. "Are you okay, little one?" asked Richard, kneeling beside Emily and helping her to get up. Emily looked at Richard with her big brown eyes and smiled, even though she had scraped her knee in the fall. "Yes, I am. Thank you, sir. It was just a little stumble." Richard helped Emily gather her school materials, noticing that the notebooks were used and some pencils were worn down until they almost had no more graphite. But everything was organized with care, showing the appreciation the girl had for her few things. "Are you late for school?" asked Richard. "Yes, I am," replied Emily, checking her watch again. "Aunt Tanya had to leave earlier today for work, and I ended up sleeping a little bit longer." Richard looked in the direction of the school and then at Emily. "Would you like me to give you a ride? My car is on the corner over there." Emily hesitated for a moment. Tanya had always taught her not to accept rides from strangers, but there was something in Richard's gentle manner that reassured her. "Are you known around here?" asked Emily, showing impressive maturity for her age. "Well, I've been frequenting Mr. Anthony's bakery for a few weeks," said Richard. "You can ask him about me if you want." Emily looked in the direction of the bakery and saw Mr. Anthony at the door, who waved to her. This reassured her. "All right, I'll accept the ride," said Emily, "but only to school. Aunt Tanya said I can't go anywhere with people I don't know." Richard smiled, admiring the girl's prudence. Of course, only to school. During the brief journey to the school, Richard tried to talk with Emily, but without asking very personal questions. He wanted to get to know her naturally without seeming invasive. "Do you like studying?" asked Richard. "I like it a lot," replied Emily with enthusiasm. "I want to be a veterinarian when I grow up, so I can take care of the little animals that live on the street." Richard felt his heart tighten. Of course, Emily wanted to be a veterinarian. It was perfectly in line with her generous personality and her concern for those in need, including animals. "It's a beautiful profession," said Richard. "Have you ever taken care of any animal?" "Oh yes, I feed the kitties and puppies that stay in the lot near my house," said Emily. "Sometimes they get sick, and I feel very sad because I don't know how to help. That's why I want to learn." Richard was increasingly impressed with the girl. They arrived at the school, and Emily prepared to get out of the car. "Thank you very much for the ride, mister," said Emily, realizing she didn't know the name of the kind man. Richard hesitated for a moment. "Richard," he finally said. "My name is Richard." "Thank you, Mr. Richard. My name is Emily." "Nice to meet you, Emily." The girl got out of the car and ran toward the school entrance, waving to Richard before disappearing among the other students. Richard stayed parked in front of the school for a few minutes, processing that first real encounter with Emily. The girl was even more special than he had imagined. There was a purity and kindness in her way of being that touched him deeply. Driving back home, Richard reflected on how different he felt. For the first time in years, he had had a genuine conversation, without ulterior motives, without games of interest. Emily had spoken to him in a spontaneous and truthful way, something he rarely experienced in his usual social circle. When he arrived at the apartment, he found Patricia getting ready for a charity lunch at the club. She was wearing a designer dress and several expensive pieces of jewelry. "Where were you, Richard?" asked Patricia, touching up her lipstick. "I tried calling you several times." "I went out to take care of some things," Richard replied vaguely. "I hope you haven't forgotten that we have the Blackwells' dinner tonight," said Patricia. "It's important that you look presentable. There will be very influential people there." Richard looked at Patricia, and for the first time felt completely out of place in that environment. Her concerns seemed so futile compared to the simplicity and authenticity he had just experienced with Emily. "Richard, are you listening to me?" insisted Patricia, irritated by her husband's lack of attention. "Yes, I am," replied Richard, but his mind was still in Hope Village, thinking about the girl who wanted to be a veterinarian to care for abandoned animals. In the weeks that followed the first meeting with Emily, Richard established a routine that divided his life into two completely different worlds. In the morning, he would visit Hope Village, have coffee at Mr. Anthony's bakery, and occasionally meet Emily on her way to school. At night, he would return home and feign interest in Patricia's social events and empty conversations. Richard began to discreetly help the community where Emily lived. He anonymously paid the electricity bill for the blue house where she lived with Tanya. He deposited money into the school's account to pay for school supplies that were lacking. He hired a veterinarian to provide free consultations for the animals in the vacant lot. Everything always done anonymously, as a benefactor who prefers not to be identified. With each passing day, Richard felt more distant from his previous life. Conversations with Patricia became even more superficial, and he began to openly question some of her prejudiced statements. "Richard, you've been acting very strangely lately," said Patricia during a dinner at home, delicately cutting a piece of imported salmon. "Yesterday you said that perhaps we should make more donations to charitable institutions. Where did that idea come from?" "Don't you think we have a social responsibility, Patricia?" asked Richard, once again testing his wife's reaction. "We have much more than we need. We could help people who really need it." Patricia laughed with disdain. "Richard, you're getting sentimental. We already pay our taxes, which, theoretically, should be enough to solve social problems. Besides, helping these people too much only makes them more dependent and lazy." Richard felt a growing anger inside him. "What people, Patricia? You refer to less fortunate people as if they were a species." "Because they are different, Richard," exclaimed Patricia, hitting her fork on the plate. "We work hard, study, dedicate ourselves to achieve what we have. These people want everything handed to them on a silver platter without making any effort." Richard thought of Tanya, working in 3 different houses to support Emily. He thought of Emily herself, dedicated to her studies despite all the difficulties, always helping others even though she had so little. How could Patricia be so ignorant about the reality of people? "Have you ever lived among poor people, Patricia?" asked Richard, genuinely curious. "Have you ever had the opportunity to know their stories?" "Of course not," replied Patricia, as if the question were absurd. "Why would I do that? I talk to the housemaids when necessary, but that's work. I have no interest in knowing about their personal lives." At that moment, Richard had an epiphany. Patricia wasn't just prejudiced. She was profoundly ignorant about the reality of most of the American population. Her opinions were based on stereotypes and assumptions, never on real experiences. On Saturday of that week, Richard made a courageous decision. He invited Emily and Tanya for a trip to the park. For some days, he had been talking with Emily after school, always in the presence of other adults from the neighborhood, to avoid arousing suspicion, and had created a genuine friendship with the girl. "Aunt Tanya, Mr. Richard is very nice," Emily told Tanya on Friday night. "He always asks about my studies and encourages me. Today he said that if I continue studying well, I might get a scholarship for veterinary college." Tanya was initially suspicious of Richard's intentions. It was rare for a well-dressed and apparently rich man to take a genuine interest in a poor child without having some hidden motivation. But after a few weeks observing the interactions between Richard and Emily, she realized there was something different about him. "Emily told me that you invited her to go to the park tomorrow," said Tanya when she met Richard at the bakery that Saturday morning. "May I ask why?" Richard was prepared for this conversation. "Tanya, can I be honest with you? I don't have children, and spending time with Emily has been very good for me. She's a special girl full of dreams and kindness. I would like to be able to help her in some way if you allow it." Tanya studied Richard's face for a few moments. There was sincerity in his eyes, something she had learned to recognize after years of working in the homes of different families. "Do you have children, Richard?" asked Tanya. "I don't," replied Richard. "My wife and I, well, our life took other paths. "And does your wife know that you're here making friends with the poor girl from the suburbs?" asked Tanya perceptively. Richard was silent for a few moments. "My wife and I have very different views on many things, Tanya. She wouldn't understand what I'm doing here." Tanya nodded her head. She knew rich men whose wives lived in bubbles of privilege, completely disconnected from the reality of most people. "All right, you can take Emily to the park," said Tanya. "But I'm going too. And I want to make it clear that if you try to do anything inappropriate with my girl, I'll call the police immediately." Richard smiled, respecting Tanya's maternal protection. "I wouldn't expect anything different from an aunt who loves her niece as much as you love Emily." The trip to the park was revealing for Richard. He saw Emily running freely across the lawns, playing on the playground equipment, laughing loudly without worrying about appearances or social etiquette. He talked at length with Tanya, who told him about the difficulties of raising a child alone, about her dreams for Emily's future, about how much she missed her sister who had passed away. "Richard," said Tanya during a pause while Emily was playing on the slide, "can I ask you a personal question? Why are you so interested in our lives? It's not normal for a man in your social position to mix with people like us." Richard took a deep breath. The moment had come to tell at least part of the truth. "Tanya, a few weeks ago I did something that I deeply regret," began Richard. "I was going through a difficult time in my marriage, influenced by prejudiced ideas about people from lower social classes. I decided to conduct a cruel test to prove a stupid theory." Tanya looked at him attentively, realizing he was about to make an important confession. "I left a briefcase with a lot of money on a street in this neighborhood, hoping that someone would find it and try to keep it," continued Richard, his voice breaking. "I wanted to prove that poor people are dishonest, but the one who found the briefcase was Emily." Tanya's eyes widened, immediately making the connection. "The briefcase that Emily found a few weeks ago was mine," completed Richard. "And what Emily did with that money completely destroyed all my prejudices. She didn't keep a single cent for herself. She used everything to help other needy people, abandoned animals, orphaned children, needy elderly." Tanya remained silent for several minutes, processing that revelation. Richard continued, "I began to discreetly investigate Emily's life, not with bad intentions, but because I needed to understand how a 7-year-old child could have so much kindness in her heart, and what I discovered completely transformed me. Gambley isn't just honest, she's extraordinary. Even living in hardship, she always finds ways to help those who need it more than she does." "So you approached us out of guilt," said Tanya, with a mixture of disappointment and understanding in her voice. "It began that way," admitted Richard, "but it transformed into something much deeper. Emily and you showed me what true family, true kindness, true humanity are. You saved me from an empty and prejudiced life." Tanya looked in Emily's direction, who continued playing happily, unaware of the serious conversation taking place between the adults. "She doesn't know, does she?" asked Tanya. "No, she doesn't. And I don't know if I should tell her. I don't want her to feel used or betrayed." Tanya thought for a few moments before answering. "Richard, what you did was wrong. Using a child in an experiment based on prejudices was cruel. But what you're doing now, the way you're trying to redeem yourself, that shows that you're a person capable of change and growth." Richard felt a deep emotion upon hearing Tanya's words. He had feared that she would expel him from their lives when she knew the truth. "Emily has the right to know the truth," continued Tanya, "but at the right time in the right way. For now, what's important is that you continue being this new man that she helped create, not the prejudiced man you were before." When Emily came, running back to where they were sitting, Richard looked at her with a paternal love he had never felt before. That girl had saved not only his worldview, but his very soul. And now he knew that he would do anything to protect her and ensure that she had all the opportunities she deserved in life. 2 months after the revelation to Tanya, Richard made the most difficult and most liberating decision of his life. During dinner in the lakeside apartment, while Patricia was talking about the expensive decoration she had ordered for the living room, Richard interrupted her. "Patricia, I need to talk to you about something important." said Richard, turning off the television and sitting face to face with his wife. Now, Richard? I was watching the program about fashion trends for next summer, complained Patricia, clearly irritated by the interruption. It's exactly about this that I need to talk, said Richard. About this superficial life we're living, about your prejudices, about the person I've become by your side. Patricia frowned. What are you talking about? What prejudices? Patricia, for 15 years you've shaped my way of seeing the world, began Richard. You convinced me that poor people are dishonest, that they don't deserve our help, that they are naturally inferior to us. Because it's true, exclaimed Patricia. Richard, are you having an existential crisis? This is ridiculous. No, Patricia. What's ridiculous is what I've become by your side, a man full of prejudices, incapable of seeing the goodness that exists in most people. Richard took a deep breath before continuing. I met a girl, a 7-year-old orphan who lives in a poor neighborhood of the city. She taught me more about humanity and generosity in a few weeks than you taught me in 15 years of marriage. Patricia abruptly stood up from the armchair. A girl? Richard, are you going out with a child? That's sick. It's nothing like that, Patricia. She's a child who showed me what true kindness is. She found a large amount of money on the street, and instead of keeping it to solve her own problems, used it all to help other needy people. And you believe this story? Patricia laughed with contempt. Richard, you're being manipulated. This girl and her family must have invented this story to get money from you. I saw it with my own eyes, Patricia, shouted Richard, losing his patience for the first time in years. I saw a 7-year-old child donating hundreds of thousands of dollars to animal shelters, orphanages, needy elderly, without keeping anything for herself. Patricia looked at him with an expression of total contempt. You've completely lost your mind, Richard. You're destroying our marriage, our social position, everything we've built together, because of a fantasy story from a slum. Girl, our social position? Richard laughed bitterly. Patricia, our social position is a farce. We are empty people, surrounded by other empty people, pretending that our wealth makes us superior to others. The discussion extended for hours. Patricia tried all possible arguments to dissuade Richard from his crazy ideas. She talked about what people would say, about the social scandal, about how he was throwing away a lifetime of achievements. Richard, if you continue with these absurd ideas, I'll have to ask for a divorce, Patricia finally said, thinking that this threat would make him back down. Richard looked her in the eyes and for the first time in 15 years saw who Patricia really was, a cold, prejudiced woman incapable of true love or empathy. All right, Patricia, said Richard calmly. If that's what you want, I accept the divorce. Patricia was shocked. She hadn't expected Richard to accept so easily. She had bet that he would back down, as he always did. In the months that followed, the divorce process was turbulent. Patricia tried to get most of the assets, spreading rumors about Richard having had a mental breakdown. But Richard didn't care. For the first time in years, he felt free and true to himself. During this difficult period, Richard increasingly relied on his friendship with Tanya and Emily. They became his true family, offering the emotional support and authenticity that he had never found in his previous social circle. It was Emily who suggested that Richard create a foundation to help needy children. Mr. Richard, she said during one of their walks in the park, you could use your money to help other children like me. There are a lot of people who need help. Richard was moved by the suggestion. Once again, Emily demonstrated her natural generosity, thinking not of herself but of how they could help other people. It's a wonderful idea, Emily, said Richard, but I would like you to help me decide how to do this in the best way. Me? Asked Emily, surprised. But I'm just a child. What do I understand about these things? You understand about kindness, replied Richard, and that's the most important thing. The day came when Richard decided to tell the whole truth to Emily. Tanya was present, providing moral support for both. They were sitting in the small front garden of the Blue House, where everything had begun months earlier. Emily, began Richard with a breaking voice, I need to tell you something about how we met. About the briefcase you found. Emily looked at him with her big, curious eyes. What about the briefcase, Mr. Richard? "The briefcase was mine," said Richard. "I purposely placed it on the street to test if you or someone else would try to keep the money." Emily was silent for a few moments, processing that information. "You were testing me?" she finally asked. "Yes," admitted Richard, with tears in his eyes. "And I deeply regret that. I was wrong, full of prejudices, influenced by bad ideas about people like you and your aunt." "And now?" asked Emily. "Do you still think that way?" "No," replied Richard immediately. "You taught me that I was completely wrong. You showed me that there are extraordinary people everywhere, regardless of how much money they have." Emily was thoughtful for a few minutes. Richard and Tanya waited anxiously for her reaction. "Mr. Richard," Emily finally said, "what's important isn't what you did before, but who you are now. And you're a good person who's helping me achieve my dreams." Richard couldn't hold back the tears. He hugged Emily with the affection of a father who had finally found his daughter of the heart. 6 months later, everyone's life had completely changed. Richard had finalized his divorce from Patricia, who continued spreading gossip about her ex-husband's madness in the social circles of Chicago's elite. But Richard didn't care. He had found something much more valuable than the approval of superficial people. He had found a true family. The Emily Foundation, as Richard decided to call the charitable institution he created, became one of the most respected organizations in Chicago in the area of child protection and animal welfare. Emily actively participated in the decisions, always suggesting practical ways to help children in vulnerable situations. "Mr. Richard," said Emily during one of the foundation's meetings, "what if we created a free veterinary school? That way, other children like me could learn to care for the little animals." Richard smiled, once again impressed by the girl's humanitarian vision. "It's a brilliant idea, Emily. Let's study how to put this into practice." Tanya had left her job as a house cleaner and now worked as an administrative coordinator at the foundation. Richard insisted on paying for a business administration college for her, recognizing her natural intelligence and organizational capacity. "Richard," said Tanya during a dinner at the new house he had bought in Hope Village. He had insisted on moving to the neighborhood where he had met Emily. "Sometimes I still can't believe how our life has changed." "I'm the one who should thank you," replied Richard. "You saved me from an empty life and taught me what really matters." Emily, now 8 years old, studied at one of the best private schools in Chicago, but never lost her humility and generosity. Every weekend, she insisted on visiting the old neighborhood to play with the children who still lived there and to care for the animals in the vacant lot, which had now been transformed into a small sanctuary with the help of the foundation. "Aunt Tanya, Mr. Richard," said Emily on a Sunday afternoon, "did you know that happiness isn't in the money we have, but in the good we do for others?" Richard and Tanya exchanged emotional looks. That extraordinary girl continued to teach them about life with her precocious wisdom. A year later, during the anniversary ceremony of the Emily Foundation, Richard was invited to give a speech. On stage, before hundreds of people, beneficiaries, volunteers, donors, he held Emily's hand and began to speak. "2 years ago, I was a rich man, but poor in spirit. I lived surrounded by prejudices and distrust, believing that people were naturally selfish and dishonest, but a 7-year-old girl completely changed my life." Richard looked at Emily, who smiled shyly by his side. Emily didn't know it, but she was being tested. I had left a briefcase with a lot of money on the street, hoping to prove that she would try to keep what wasn't hers. But Emily did something I never expected. She used all that money to help other needy people without keeping anything for herself. The audience murmured in admiration, and some applauded. That gesture destroyed all my prejudices and showed me that true wealth lies in generosity, compassion, the ability to care for others. Emily taught me that kindness doesn't depend on the bank account, but on the size of the heart. Richard paused, emotional. That's why this foundation exists, not only to help needy children, but to spread the lesson that Emily taught me. That all of us, regardless of our origin or social condition, have the capacity to do good and transform the world around us. When Richard finished his speech, the entire audience rose in an emotional ovation. Emily hugged Richard tightly, whispering in his ear, "Mr. Richard, you've become the most beautiful person I know." That night, after all the guests had left, Richard, Tanya, and Emily sat in the garden of the house, observing the stars. There was a deep peace among them, the peace of those who had found the true meaning of life. "Mr. Richard," said Emily, breaking the silence, "do you remember the day you gave me a ride to school?" "Of course I remember," replied Richard. "I knew. You were special," said Emily. "Not because you had a nice car or expensive clothes, but because your eyes were kind, and kind eyes never lie." Richard once again felt the extraordinary wisdom of that girl. Emily had seen his kindness even when he himself didn't know it existed. 5 years had passed since the day of the briefcase. Richard, now 57, had become one of the most respected philanthropists in America. The Emily Foundation had helped thousands of children and created dozens of innovative social projects. Emily, at 12, continued to be the generous and wise girl she had always been. Her grades at school were excellent, and she firmly maintained her dream of becoming a veterinarian. But more important than that, she continued to be an example of kindness to everyone around her. Patricia, who had tried to marry again but couldn't find someone who would tolerate her venomous personality, occasionally appeared in the social columns criticizing her ex-husband's eccentricities. But her words no longer had the power to hurt Richard. He had learned that the opinion of bitter people is worth nothing compared to true love. During Emily's 12th birthday party, Richard had a surprise. The girl asked to speak to all the guests, friends from school, neighbors from the neighborhood, foundation employees. "Everyone," said Emily, climbing onto a chair to be taller. "I wanted to thank Mr. Richard for everything he's done for me and Aunt Tanya. But mainly, I wanted to thank him for teaching me that sometimes people do wrong things, not because they're bad, but because they're lost." Richard felt his heart tighten. Emily continued, "Mr. Richard told me that he tested me because he was confused about people, but when he saw that I used the money to help others, he understood that he had been mistaken. And since then, he's become the best person I know." The girl got down from the chair and ran to hug Richard. "Mr. Richard, thank you for leaving that briefcase on the street. Not because it had money inside, but because that's how you discovered who you really were inside." All those present applauded emotionally. Richard hugged Emily with tears in his eyes, knowing that he had been blessed to have this extraordinary girl in his life. That night, when the party ended and Emily went to bed, Richard and Tanya talked on the porch of the house. "Richard," said Tanya, "you saved Emily's life, but I think she saved yours too." "Without a doubt," agreed Richard. "Emily gave me back my humanity. She taught me that true wealth is in being able to make a difference in people's lives." "And now," asked Tanya, "what are your plans for the future?" Richard smiled, looking at the starry sky. "Continue learning from Emily, continue helping needy children through the foundation, and mainly, continue being grateful every day for having found you two." "We are grateful too, Richard." Emily gained a father of the heart, and I gained a brother. They remained silent for a few minutes, appreciating the serenity of that moment. "You know, Tanya," Richard finally said, "sometimes I think about what would have happened if Emily had acted differently that day, if she had kept the money from the briefcase." "But she didn't," replied Tanya, "because that's Emily's essence. She will always choose to help others, even when it means sacrificing something of her own. And that's exactly why she's so special," said Richard. "Emily taught me that true nobility doesn't come from the cradle or the bank account, but from character. And she has the noblest character I've ever known." When Richard was preparing to go to bed that night, he stopped at Emily's bedroom door to take one last look at the girl who had changed his life. She slept peacefully, with a slight smile on her face, probably dreaming about the animals she would help when she became a veterinarian. Richard whispered a silent, "Thank you," and headed to his room, knowing that the next day he would wake up, being a better person, just as had happened every day since Emily had entered his life. The briefcase had disappeared long ago, but its symbolism remained alive in Richard's memory. It had been planned as a trap to prove human dishonesty, but it had transformed into the key that opened the doors to redemption, true love, and the discovery of true happiness. And all of this happened because one day, an orphan girl saw a briefcase full of money on the ground and decided, even hungry, even needy, even with no one by her side, that the right thing was to use it to do good. Dear listeners, we hope that the story of Richard and Emily has touched your hearts deeply. This narrative reminds us that true wealth is not in what we possess, but in the good we do for others, and that a single generous action can transform lives forever. If this story moved you as much as it moved us to tell it, don't forget to subscribe to our channel to receive more stories that celebrate the best of human nature. Leave a like if you believe, just as Richard learned, that kindness can be found in the most unexpected places. In the comments, tell us, have you ever experienced or witnessed an act of generosity that changed your perspective on people? Your stories can inspire other listeners